Last week, we wrapped up with the material approach or the political economy approach in anthropology, and as we know, that was one that was generated out of the work of Karl Marx. And today we turn to Max Weber. So as you can see, Marx was the predecessor of Weber, sort of the generation before him. They're both born in Germany. Marx in Trier in the southwest, and Weber in Erfurt in the more or less the middle of Germany. So we could think of each one as motivated by a particular question. Marx's question was, what is it that creates social change, or what is the engine of history? And for him, class conflict was the answer to that question. So today when we turn to Weber, his question is about social action. So how do we understand social action? How do we study it? He thinks then that this is the field of sociology. He says sociology then concerns itself with the interpretive understanding of social action and thereby with a causal explanation of its course and consequences. So just as with Marx, I'm going to start off by giving you a little bit of work that is not in the readings that you had to do, but comes from Economy and Society, a different work, so that you can sort of get some of the orientation to his work without having to read this. And then we'll get to the piece that he was that we assigned for this week from this other work. Okay, so the interpretive understanding of social action and thereby with a causal explanation of its course and consequences. So what causes social action? We understand that with an interpretive method. We could rephrase this as, how do we go about understanding social action? And so then his methodological answer is through interpretation. So we can already see that this is a different kind of approach than the one that we got with Marx. Marx was not concerned with interpreting what was happening. Marx was interested in analyzing the particular social conflicts that drove any particular epoch. Weber is concerned then with this question of interpretation. Action here means that the actor attaches subjective meaning to his or her behavior, so that when I act, if I attach some meaning to it, then it's social action. So then it's social when the subjective meaning takes account of and orients to others' behavior. So that when my action then is one that I understand is oriented towards others, like for example the performance of this lecture is something that I attach a particular meaning to and it's oriented toward others, that's social action. Okay, but then attaching meaning, what's that all about? Well, he thinks that meaning can be of two types. The actual meaning of a given case or a particular actor. So what is it that I actually mean, I as the social actor in this case, or a theoretically conceived pure type, which he also calls an ideal type. So then the question is not, what do I as the actor think in this particular situation, but what does an abstract actor in an abstract situation? So if you think of one of his favorite examples, the stock market, when you have somebody trading on the stock market, you can look at the particular individual who you can go and ask, what were you thinking at this time? Or you can imagine an abstract scenario with an abstract actor, so not any particular human being, and say, what would a perfectly rational person do in this given situation here. This situation need not be a real one. It could be an invented one. But nonetheless, the point is then you're dealing with an ideal type, an ideal actor. And then you can work out, by contrast, what people actually do in that given situation to see how far they deviate from the ideal type in their action. So this is then the two kinds of meaning that he has in mind: the actual meaning in a given case, or the ideal type. Typically then, with the ideal type, this is action attributed to only a hypothetical rational actor. Now, he doesn't say this, but it may be that it can only be a rational actor that he considers, so that the ideal type may simply not apply to other types of actors, because we can't idealize them along the same sort of clear rational principles that we would with a rational actor. We can't, for example, in the stock exchange example, say what would be the mathematically best action to take in a given situation when we're no longer in the realm of rationality. So this is not a major point. Just I wanted to flag that on the way by. Okay, so then let's just say, for the purposes of argument, that we're dealing with a hypothetical rational actor, one not influenced by, say, sentiments or emotions. So then we can compare this actual action by a concrete actor with the ideal type. In this way, he thinks, we're able to start to gauge what the influence of irrational factors have been on that individual or on that action. Now, subjective meaning then arises when we orient our action to something, understand it in relation to our projects, either as a means or an end, so that through our acting, we're applying meaning to something, and that meaning comes within the context of the project that we're undertaking, what it is that we're doing at the time. So then, as anthropologists, our job is to interpret an actor's action on the basis of the actor's understanding. So it's not simply that we're watching something unfold and analyzing it without any regard to how the actors involved interpret the situation. Rather, we're observing that situation and taking into account and interpreting how the actors themselves understand the situation that they're in and the actions that they're taking. In short, we interpret the actor's interpretation. Again, you can see this is quite a distinct approach to understanding social action from the one that we get from Marx. By way of an example, we could say, so what is the meaning of this mountain? In and of itself, this is kind of an empty question. We don't know. It's not clear what this mountain is or why anyone would have any projects toward it. It's a vacuous question from an anthropological point of view. However, once we understand that that mountain is Mount Everest, that the person involved is Sir Edmund Hillary, then we can see that we can analyze his action with respect to the mountain, not just say in technical terms of how one climbs such a thing, but specifically we can interpret his interpretation of his actions with respect to that mountain, so that the interest in taking on a challenge that others hadn't taken on before him, something like that. Then we can understand how his action becomes motivated in particular ways by interpreting his interpretation. This then helps us to move to the idea of motivated behavior. So then we want to attend not just to the action as something that we describe as sort of a mechanical thing, but as motivated. So we want to interpret then actors' motivations. Social action then has yet another dimension. It orients to the action of others, so that we can have action that is not oriented to others, and then it just won't be social action, it'll just be another kind of action. Social action is action oriented toward the action of others. We're engaging through our action with others, and we're orienting our interpretation of our action to the action of others. So again, the anthropologist is going to take a look from a point of interpreting the interpretations of the actors as they are considering their actions with respect to the actions of other social actors. So you can see then that it starts to become fairly intricate fairly quickly. He puts this in terms of social action as an actor's behavior meaningfully oriented to that of others. Meaningfully oriented, not from the point of view of the anthropologist, though it will be in a moment, but meaningfully oriented by the actor, him or herself. So then we can see in these cases, I don't know why I picked pictures only of women greeting and taking their leave from other women, but anyway, nonetheless, we see here action that is oriented to the action of others. That's why these are examples of social action. Whereas we can see there's action here, there's movement, but it's just not social action. So with these in mind, meaning, action, social action, and ideal type, we can turn to class, status, and party. I was going to give you another piece, charismatic authority, as well. I'll leave the slides for that at the very end of this, but because I haven't assigned it, I'm not going to hold you responsible for it. So charismatic authority could be an example of how he thinks of ideal type. But for the moment, the thing that's most pressing for our purposes is this idea of interpretation. And here, class, status, and party is the more helpful piece. So then we'll see in it how it is that he's putting his concepts to work. In class, status, and party, he begins with a discussion of power, which he understands to be the ability of individuals to, quote, realize their own will in a communal action even against the resistance of others. Now, this will be an important thing to keep in mind when we get to the very end of this chapter, this essay that he writes. But for now, we can see that the notion of power that he's using is inherently social, right? That there's no idea of power here, no sociological or anthropological notion of power that is not oriented toward other people. So it is the ability of an individual or a group to realize their own will in communal actions, working together then, even against the resistance of others. So that through and through, this is social in nature. Economic power then is a type of power, so you could think of it as a subset of power, but it's not identical with power as such. There are other forms of power, so that power could also be conditioned by honor. This will be the other major theme that he touches on in this essay. But again, not all power entails honor, and not all honor derives from power. So we can see these things as overlapping with one another, but not strictly identical with one another. He thinks then that we can study the distribution of power within a community by examining its classes, its status groups, and its parties. Class situation, so this is the first one, has specifically to do with market situation. So it imagines that there's a certain form of power and it occurs within the market. So through relations of exchange, you could think. And class situation, relative to a market, implies first, people share a specific causal aspect of their life chances. Insofar as, second, it is exclusively economic, concerning possessions and income opportunities. And third, it arises in commodity and labor markets. So he's thinking then of commodity and labor markets as more or less being the only markets that exist economically. And so in a nutshell, what he's saying is that your class situation concerns your position in the commodity and labor markets insofar as they determine your life chances. So that if you are one who has capital, then being an entrepreneur is within the scope of your life chances. If you are a laborer without any capital, then he would say your class situation is more constrained, that you don't have capital to allow you to become an entrepreneur. So you'll have to sell your labor, and that shapes your life chances in determinative ways. It establishes your class position. Property, then, is a decisive feature of class. Why? Because only property owners can compete for and acquire highly valued goods and profitable deals. So think of, for example, Google's acquisition of YouTube. Now, non-property owners, say employees at Google, were not themselves in a position to purchase YouTube. Why? Because they lacked the necessary property to do it. The owners of Google were in that position. They had the property necessary to make that acquisition. So the owners and the workers were in different class positions with respect to their capacity to acquire highly valued goods, YouTube in this case being the highly valued good, and to secure profitable deals. So acquiring YouTube is something that can generate more profit. It can make a better deal. Now, this is also going to be the case in the labor market, where the owners of capital, of property, are in a relatively stronger bargaining position than propertyless workers. And so they're the ones who are in a position to get more profitable deals from the negotiation around, for example, wages. Part of this phenomenon is that only the propertied can transfer property from fortune to capital. So fortune being something like savings or stocks, perhaps, the possession of valuable items that they could sell to turn into cash that they can then use as capital. Unpropertied people, laborers, for example, cannot do that. They don't have the property, the fortune that they can liquidate and turn into capital. Property and its lack, therefore, define class situations or market situations. What is your position within the market? So you can imagine, in a way, you have purchasers of labor and sellers of labor. Sellers of labor are in that position because they haven't got the property that allows them to open businesses and to be entrepreneurial. and therefore they're in a position of selling their labor rather than purchasing the labor of others. And so, one's chances in the market are decisive for one's individual fate. Economic interest, therefore, is the factor creating class. So you can think of the interests of laborers as not strictly aligned with the interests of owners. Why? Because owners want to purchase labor at a price that allows them to make money by employing this labor. Laborers want to get paid more for the work that they do. So they have competing interests in that case. So you can see, in a way, this is not strictly incompatible with what Marx is saying, but the approach is quite distinct. The trick is, and this is going to be one of the major points of differentiation between Marx and Weber, is that class interest, in Weber's view, is ambiguous. So how we pursue class interest varies widely, as does the degree to which class situation spawns communal action. So he does imagine that communities can be constructed of classes, but that's not the same thing as saying a class is a community. And this is where the trouble is going to start for him. So action organized by actors' feelings that they belong together is communal action. He's not taking it for granted the way that Marx does, that workers will understand themselves as belonging together and therefore of working collectively for communal action. Communal action then emerges from the mass actions of members of a class, depending on the extent of class contrast, and especially, quote, the transparency of the connections between the causes and consequences of class action. So what does he mean by this? He's saying that the extent of class contrast is important. That means then not that it's my ability to identify with other members of my class that's important. Rather, it's my ability to contrast my position with members of another class. And insofar as a collectivity of us is capable of doing that, of contrasting our position collectively with the position of others collectively, then we can start talking about a communal action based on class. But if we can't do that, then we're not able to work communally as a class. We're not able to collectivize. Why? Because the second part, it requires transparency. It has to be clear to us that there are connections between our class positions and the causes and consequences for our life actions of the difference between our class position and the class position of others. And this, in principle, I think could happen on either side, so that owners of businesses could either see one another as competitors, in which case they're not going to be able to coordinate. It's not going to be transparent to them that they share a class interest, and therefore they're not going to be able, they won't be capable of communal action because they can't collectivize, they can't come together that way. But on the other hand, if they see themselves as having a shared set of interests that are transparently counterposed to the interests of a competing class, say employees, perhaps employees who want to unionize as an example, then because their shared class interest amongst themselves becomes transparent, clear to them, then they can work collectively on a communal action. So again, one of the differences here between Marx and Weber is that Weber doesn't see class identity, let's say, as necessarily taking a communal form It might, but it might not. And that will depend on the transparency of the class differences, the class oppositions even, and also this sort of communal potential exists not just for the mass of workers, which is what Marx focused on, but for anyone in any class position. In principle, they could collectivize, work communally, no matter what their class position is. But again, his point is they can only do that if it is transparent to the members of that class that they share an interest over against the interests of another class. So the idea of contrast, of being able to see a contrast between my class and another class, that's what's crucial for him. So again, this is an interpretive moment. The interpretation of the social actors of their class situation is crucial to their ability or their inability to engage in communal action. In short, how we understand things determines what we do. You can think of it as providing the horizon for what we can imagine ourselves doing. Whatever lies beyond the horizon of our understanding doesn't determine what we do. It's only what we understand that determines what we do, how we act. Secondly, then, we have to see differences in class. We have to see those differences as differences. If we can't see them as differences, then we can't differentiate our class position from the class position of others, and we can't organize collectively on the basis of some shared set of interests, because we can't make the contrast necessary to see sort of who's in and who's out. In a nutshell, then, for Weber, class action is not inevitable. For Marx, it really was. For Weber, it's not obvious to him that class action can or will occur. It may, but it requires this kind of contrasting, transparent understanding of one's own class position and the position of others who share that class situation. Classes, then, are not communities, right? So as I said, communities can be made up of classes, but the inverse is not necessarily the case. So when communal action on the basis of class does occur, it happens between members of different classes, right? So it's one class acting against another class. Class action then occurs as communal action, not on the basis of identity, but of antagonism. So that it's not the starting point for Weber is not that I and other workers naturally identify with one another as workers, and that's how we form some notion of community. Rather, he says, it's only when we get antagonism that we can understand as us against them, that we can start to see communal action on the basis of class arising. Further then, labor conflicts occur between the most direct proximal opponents, manufacturers, business executives, and not those who are more distant, like bankers, stockholders, rentiers, even though they receive unearned gains. So on this, he says, so he's talking about workers and owners engaging in price wars. And he says, this is so in spite of the fact that it is precisely the cash boxes of the rentier, the shareholder, the banker, into which the more or less unearned gains flow, rather than into the pockets of the manufacturers or the business executives. So there's a way then that he thinks that proximity of worker and owner is what allows the contrast to be stark enough for class action to occur, even though, in fact, the ones who are really making the unearned profits from the labor of workers are people like stockholders who have who provide no labor to the business at all, and so then there's a sense in which the transparency of the class situation for workers ends with the business owners. That's sort of the ambit of their understanding of their class situation and who their antagonists are. Even though in Weber's view, he would say there are people in a class position that is much more antagonistic even than their employers. Why? Because at least their employers contribute something in order to lay claim to some share of the income of the business. Shareholders and bankers, he's saying, contribute nothing in terms of economic value to the business, and yet they're the ones who are reaping rewards. But because that is not so immediate, it's not as transparent to those who are engaging in communal action on the basis of class identity that they are also antagonists. So again, interpreting the interpretation of the social actor is what allows us, in Weber's view, to see this and to see why it is that labor collectivization sort of ends at a certain point. It ends with the antagonism between owner and worker and doesn't extend further than that. So in contrast to classes, status groups are communities. Classes, we'll remember, can make up a community without themselves being a community. It takes something else. It takes antagonism between classes for classes to engage in communal action. Status groups, he says, by contrast, are communities. So status situation involves aspects of life determined by the estimation of honor. Not economics then, honor. So property, he thinks, has no intrinsic relationship to status. That relationship is specific to the specific society that we're talking about and complicated because they can work antagonistically against one another, property and honor, but not necessarily. We'll see more about that in a moment. Those who wish to belong to a social circle, he says, have to adopt a specific style of life. So then it's not simply that you have a certain kind of status and that people just recognize it and honor it. You only maintain that status insofar as you engage in a specific style of life, one that maintains your position of honor. So at the most extreme, status groups develop into castes. So caste and class then will function in dramatically different ways. And this will be important for Weber's analysis here. He thinks class distinctions are a matter not just of law or of convention, but of ritual. They have a kind of ritual definition to them. So, in this case, contact with members of a lower caste implies a ritualistic impurity or a stigma that can be fixed only through a religious act. So that when you, so to speak, become polluted by contact with someone of a lower caste, you then need to go through a ritual process of cleansing to get rid of that pollution. This is not the same thing as ethnic distinctions, though you can see how you could mistake them. Ethnic distinctions, he would say, can be horizontal, they're unconnected. So that within every ethnic group, they'll think our way is the superior way and the ways of members of another group are inferior to ours. They don't have the same kind of respect for honor that we have, defined as we define it. So we are better than they, is the way that that kind of horizontal disconnection will work. Castes, he says, are different. They are vertically connected in a system of superordination and subordination, so that within a caste system, there will be an acknowledgement by those who are subordinate that they share the system of honor with those who are superordinate with respect to them, but that they inhabit a lower position, a subordinate position to those who are superordinate. So then ethnic differences are horizontal in nature, caste differences are vertical in nature. He says, ethnic coexistences condition a mutual repulsion and disdain, but allow each ethnic community to consider its own honor as the highest one. The caste structure brings about a social subordination and an acknowledgement of more honor in favor of the privileged caste and status groups. So then whatever form status takes, it relies on exclusivity that corresponds to honorific preferences. So those who lack the honor that you have are excluded from your status group. And this entails then both material and ideal monopolies. As an example, from something close to my own fieldwork, there is in the Grand Palace in Bangkok the Temple of the Emerald Buddha, the Emerald Buddha being probably the most revered Buddha image in Thailand. And it is the ritual obligation of the king to change the Buddha's wardrobe from one season to the next. So there are 3 seasons in Thailand: hot season, rainy season, and cool season. Cool being kind of a euphemism, never really gets cool, but anyway, cooler. And because it is ritual in nature, not just anybody can do this. Only the king can do this. So then there's a certain kind of monopoly here over there's a certain ideal monopoly, right? Only the king is in a sufficiently revered position to undertake this ritual. So you can see then on the bottom, you see in the bottom the 3 different outfits that the Emerald Buddha wears in the different seasons, and in the top you can see the current king undertaking his ritual role of changing the outfit that the Buddha is wearing. Now, of course, that also means that there are not just an ideal monopoly, but also material monopoly, expressed in this case both in the fact that it's only the king who can handle the material vestments of the Buddha, but also that the king's uniform, you can see that he's dressed, you can't say it particularly well, but he's dressed in something that looks very much like a military uniform. And it's particular to the king. Only he can wear that uniform. And so, again, there's a certain kind of material monopoly that's not really one about property. So it's not a monopoly on properties, that's possible, but it's not here. In this case, that's not what it is. But it is a material monopoly. Similarly, you could think of a religious leader like the Pope, that the Pope has a material monopoly on particular articles of clothing. Other bishops, and certainly lay people, are not allowed to wear the Pope's mitre, the red shoes, and so forth, right? So that it's not that we can't understand them simply in terms of property, but that there is a material monopoly, that the Pope has a claim, a ritual claim on that material, but it's not property in the economic sense of productive property. There is then, with status, a corresponding preferential style of life. So if we can go back to the example of the Pope, you can see with the position of the Pope, there is undeniably a certain kind of status that comes with that position. But the Pope is also expected, required even, to comport himself in particular ways, a certain style of life, so that his public appearances have to have a certain kind of style to them. He needs to present himself in a particular way. Failure to do that will diminish the honor he's accorded by his position. Privileged groups then, so we're talking about status privilege here, not economic privilege, but status privilege. Those privileged groups, in Weber's view, typically view physical labor or entrepreneurship or power arising through the market in general as undignified, so that there's something kind of tawdry or distasteful about either engaging in entrepreneurship, so being one who starts and runs a business, sort of engaging in the economic muck of life, or much less of working, that employed income is even worse than that. That will really diminish someone's honor status, so that manual labor functionally disqualifies one from status privilege. Again, if you think of the Pope or the position of the king in Thailand, neither one of those can have a business. They can't be business people as well as being king or as well as being Pope. That would diminish their honor, this engagement in, so to speak, worldly affairs. Their status honor has to elevate them above that so that they don't engage in this kind of activity. Certainly, if either the king or the Pope were to take on a job somewhere, well, you can't imagine either one of them delivering pizzas and still being in this position of status of honor privilege. So then, in this way, status and earned wealth typically stand in opposition to one another. Where the market is impersonal, having no interest in who you are, but only in your market position, status honor is entirely about who you are and therefore how you carry yourself. The trick is, though, I did say that this would become a little bit more complicated, and it does in the sense that when you have people who are of equal status, so having the same level of honor, then property will actually function as this kind of additional honor. So not property that you can be seen to be earning through your entrepreneurship. The entrepreneurship would be a problem then. But simply having more property would confer more honor, where otherwise your status is equal with another person. In brief then, classes are stratified by their relations to the production and acquisition of goods. Entrepreneurs, workers, busy producing goods, right? Status groups, by contrast, are stratified according to the principles of their consumption of goods as represented by their special styles of life. Now, the final section on power is one Weber never managed to complete it. We only get then a very brief sketch, like a page and a half, on his notion of party. Not power, party. He explains that where classes find their place in the economic order and status groups within the sphere of honor, parties operate in the halls of power. So we need to go back to that early passage right from the very beginning of the essay, where he's talking about power in terms of the ability to assert your will even against the opposition of others. That starts to give us kind of a snapshot of what it is that parties are engaged in. So parties are going to vary in nature from society to society depending on the fundamental form of stratification in that society. So a society that is predominantly defined by class will have a different kind of exercise of power than one that is predominantly defined by status. He doesn't sketch that out in any detail. He simply acknowledges that the way that parties pursue power is going to be directly connected to the form of stratification within the society, and then he leaves it there. He doesn't give us further details. However, the thing that's common to them is that parties are always going to be concerned with the struggle for domination. So whatever form domination takes, whether it takes place through the market or through status and honor, that is going to be the concern of parties, exercising their will communally, typically, within a party, exercising their will over against others. And that's it. So next week we're going to turn to Clifford Geertz. Clifford Geertz was an anthropologist who was inspired by Weber's work, as we'll see, and more or less single-handedly established the school of anthropology called interpretive, sometimes called symbolic anthropology, but more commonly called interpretive anthropology.